Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Heather. Tonight we begin with a discussion of U.S. China relations. There was a sense that with Donald Trump out of the White House, the U.S. policy might undergo subtle but significant shifts in key areas of the relationship. That might yet happen on certain issues like climate change, pandemics, etc. But the real question is, how will the relationship pan out in terms of realpolitik and even more so Machtpolitik? South and East China Seas, especially the former, are emerging as contested and one might argue disputed waters. The U.S. has its naval presence in the area since the end of the Second World War. It has treaty obligations with some states in the region, status of forces agreements, as well as extended deterrence guarantees. China is pushing its own Monroe Doctrine in these waters, or at least that's what some of the critics say. The U.S. and its allies push the argument for freedom of navigation in South China Sea. China's counter-argument is that of the nearly $5.3 trillion of trade that goes through these waters, it's vital to China's economy as also the economies of other littoral states with which China's economy is interlinked. So there is no rational reason for China to act in a manner that disrupts this flow, since it will be self-defeating. In addition to the US and China, both nuclear weapon states, France has also decided to show the reach of its flag. That's the third nuclear power in these waters. The Quad states, US, India, Japan, and Australia, participated in Malabar exercises in November last year, with clear statements coming from the US that this is to check China's blue water ambitions and projection of power. To discuss how the situation is likely to pan out, I'm joined by Rana, who's a professor of the history and politics of modern China at the University of Oxford. Professor Mitter is one of the leading authorities on China and is the author of several award-winning books. His latest book is China's Good War: How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. Rana, thank you so much for being on the program. Last we had a discussion was at another forum, so a special thanks for being on my program this time. So one of your central arguments is that to understand today's China, we have to look at China's history, because the past informs the present. So we have an existing superpower that's about 243 years old, and a civilizational state that is at least 3,000 years old if we go by the written history records that begin with the Shang dynasty. That should be significant given your broad framework. Do I get that right?
You absolutely do, Ejaz, and it's a huge pleasure to be here on your show. Now, I think when I say the importance of history is key to understanding how China behaves today, that's not, of course, to say that history is the only thing to understand. But I think an understanding of that wider trajectory, that wider perspective that you've talked about, is really key. And let me give you just two quick reasons why that is the case, one modern and one ancient. The modern one is to do with something, a phrase that geopolitics analysts throw around all the time. The idea that we are looking at either the reshoring or the crumbling of the 1945 world order. In other words, the order that emerged at the end of World War II, of which Asia and Europe, of course, were particularly central. And when you hear China's thinkers today, people like the foreign minister Wang Yi, or indeed President Xi Jinping, speaking at international forums like Davos or like the Munich Security Conference, they will quite often reference that 1945 moment, but they'll use a particular reference. They will say, don't forget, they're usually looking at the Americans when they say this, don't forget that we, the Chinese, were the first country to sign the United Nations Charter in 1945. They mean in San Francisco at the conference in April of that year. In other words, they're laying claim through that 1945 history to the Chinese part ownership of the present day international order, which of course affects us all. One other very brief example, you mentioned the Shang dynasty, this huge long stretch of thousands of years of Chinese history. Well, we should never forget that China's ideology today is made up of several different strands, which sometimes look incompatible, but actually come together in what you might call a sort of yin-yang manner, to use a Chinese phrase. In other words, of course it's communist, of course it's Marxist, that's more familiar to outsiders, but it's also drawing on the very long traditions of Chinese philosophy that date back at least 2,500 years. Thinkers like Confucius, who talked about harmony, thinkers like Han Feizi, who talked about the importance of the law law, and he meant cracking down hard with the law, I have to say. It wasn't a very liberal view of the world. All of these ancient thinkers, they are part of the mix, part of the cultural matrix that shapes even those communist leaders in China who are very much astride on the 21st century. So history is not the only thing that matters, but without it, you miss a crucial element of what China is doing today.
Right. Now, I had a very interesting conversation with Professor John Mearsheimer. This is 3 or 4 weeks ago. Now, he presented a structural realist argument with reference to how relations are going to pan out between the U.S. and China. And his argument, of course, is that this is inevitable. It's going to be a Cold War. We don't know whether it can turn into a shooting war, perhaps on the periphery, a kind of throwback to the stability paradox of the First Cold War, but that there is going to be a Cold War. Now, is that a view that you also subscribe to, or do you think there is some way out of what Professor Ellison calls the Thucydides trap?
It was a great conversation that you had with him, Ejaz. And of course, Professor Mearsheimer is famous for taking a very realist, very hardline view on the inevitability of great powers coming into a cold conflict, if not necessarily a hot conflict. I would take a slightly different view, I admit. On the one hand, in various areas, for instance, the attempts to try and indigenize technology, the attempts to try and create influence with partner countries. I mean, Pakistan is a very good example of where both the United States and China have a real interest in trying to make friends and influence people. But I think there's a factor beyond that that I think is underplayed in Professor Mearsheimer's, brilliant argument, and that is the way in which the interdependence of the two sides actually means that the kind of genuine Cold War scenario, one where the two sides are essentially behind walls, whether literal or metaphorical, simply isn't possible to maintain. So on the one hand, that could mean the fact that when we think about the huge rise in Chinese innovation, it's still very lacking in a whole variety of areas. I mean, semiconductor chips are one example that people bring up quite often. Now, it's not to say that China can't indigenize and produce many of these other things in time, but for the moment, even many of China's own very best thinkers, including some of the top tech bosses, say that decoupling, separation, in other words, the key element of a genuine Cold War, is just a pipe dream. And in that sense, I think that actually the interdependence between the two sides will mean that the conflict, and it is a conflict of values, if not necessarily of weapons, will look very different from the Cold War, and the Cold War is not the most useful analogy to understand it.
Right. One of the arguments, with reference to interdependence is, of course, the kind of trade linkages and volumes that the European powers had in the run-up to both the two world wars. So the idea, the realist argument being that that is not something that is likely to preclude war because there are other security interests. The idea that this whole issue of projecting power is it inheres in the idea of state security.
It's a very interesting idea, but the reason that I think the situation is in some ways structurally very different from the run-up to the First World War is that, in retrospect, what we saw happening in Europe at that time was the fact that you had a multilateral system of alliances, which when one particular moment triggered off a first conflict, of course, the shooting of the Archduke in Sarajevo in July of 1914, it set off a whole variety of trigger mechanisms. Now, I think that will be harder to do in the current circumstances because China has failed in one particular element that I think is very important if a country is genuinely going to lead to hegemony. China has lots of economic partners. China has lots of actors that it works with on various specific issues, but China has very few real alliances. The only formal alliance is with North Korea. It has strategic partnerships with countries like Pakistan, of course, which has a very long-standing relationship. But there's a great difference between being a great friend of China and China China basically getting in charge and coming together and asking, Islamabad whether it would actually take part in an open conflict. I think that would be a much harder sell to the Pakistani electorate. It would be much harder to sell to countries like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and other places where there's heavy Chinese economic influence. So my sense is that the imbalance of strategic alliance, where the United States, for all its flaws, still have lots of countries that are formally tied up, Japan, South Korea being the best examples in the region, but also to some extent Thailand and even sort of semi-informal alliances like Singapore. China, it seems to me, has lots of economic ties. It has the capacity for coercion, but it does not at the moment have either a capacity or a skill for alliances. And that makes it different, I think, from what happened, say, in Europe in 1914.
Right. Now, two very interesting things, which I'll refer to in response to what you've said. So, right, China stresses on connectivity, trade, and investment. You have the 15-member countries of the Regional Economic Comprehensive Partnership, and they account for about 30% of the world's population, which is almost 2.2 billion people, and 30% of global GDP, which is upwards of $26 trillion as of 2020. So, and China is central to that. Interestingly, there are even two Quad states that are part of that, Japan and Australia. Now, this is one area where, China is talking about connectivity, and then alliances. And interestingly, President Biden, in his foreign affairs article also, and later also on the campaign trail, and since then, after becoming the president, has talked about using these alliances to checkmate China. Now, these are two different paradigms or frameworks, if you will. How do you look at this? I mean, you have one country saying X thing, the other saying Y thing, and somehow one doesn't see a meeting ground.
I think that's right. I mean, essentially, there are at least three legs to, well, if it is a tripod, then there'll be three legs. And I'm not sure that there are even more elements too. But let's just think about what different issues are coming together in the scenario you just painted there, Jazz. One is to do with economics. One is to do with security. And the one I think that lies behind those, but is very important, is values. Now, I think that what the Biden administration is trying to do is to make it clear to China that it is not going to allow China to rise in the terms that China would like to put forward. In other words, China sees itself, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, as the natural hegemon. It would say that over the last 2,000 years, let's say, China has only been on the back foot for the last 200 years or so, but unfortunately that's the period that we're living through. So by using the phrase that Xi Jinping himself uses, the great renaissance of the Chinese people, the use of that term, fuxing, of returning to power, is meant to suggest the return to a sort of normal equilibrium. Whereas the American position and the position of the American allies in the region, Japan, South Korea, and others, would be that actually things really shifted in 1945, and China cannot assume that it's going to be the natural hegemon in the region. So I've posed a question. You mentioned President Biden's article in the journal Foreign Affairs, and while I am nothing like as distinguished by a million miles as he is, I did have my own article in that particular journal a month or so ago in which I posed the following question, to which I've still not had a good answer. Maybe you're the person who's going to give it to me, Ajaz, which is this. If the wider world says that China cannot rise in the terms in which it puts forward, which is, authoritarian, linked to developmental economics, very careless of liberal values, then what role should China, as the second biggest economy in the region, actually play? Because if I think the liberal world is going to say that China at that size of economy and that size of influence has no role, that is simply not something that Beijing is going to accept. It's not that we like it or dislike it. It's just that I think that a power of that size cannot simply be cut out of the matrix of Asia-Pacific power. It's not doable.
Right. I'm not sure I can, answer this, but I would draw your attention to the fact that during the First Cold War also, and now, a putative Cold War, ideology has been one of the central planks of the United States foreign policy, or at least that's how I seem to read it. And it's absolutely right that the United States has, across the world, very good relations, I would also say alliances with lots of states that are if not more, equally totalitarian compared to China. But Professor Mitter, stay with me. I'm also joined by Mr. Koorsh Shamlou, who is a lawyer and international law expert based in Paris. Mr. Shamlou, we were discussing, one of the things that we were discussing is France's presence in South China Sea and you know, the reach of its naval flag. What exactly do you think is France doing there? Is this particularly France's national interest? Is it part of France's alliance with the United States or being a member of NATO? What exactly is happening here?
Hi, thanks for having me on. Yes, France is present there because, first of all, France wants to confirm that it's a superpower, that it is a nuclear power, and it wants to reaffirm the freedom of navigation around the world. And in 2019, when Jean-Yves Le Drian, the actual French Foreign Ministry, who was the former Ministry of Defense, put out a doctrine called the Indo-Pacific French interest, strategic interest, which goes all the way from Djibouti to the French Polynesian island, which covers, let's say, half of the world. So France wants to affirm that it is present everywhere in the world. It is not scared in confronting China, even if it has to go in some way military. And they want to affirm and show Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, and the Philippines that the region is not only belonging to China, but to the world. So France, as a superpower, as a nuclear power, wants to side with the American and not let China be the only power in that region.
Right, that's interesting. Let me take this to Professor Rana Mitter here. Rana, one, France being a superpower, possibly a stretch. Secondly, as a nuclear weapon state, of course, it has the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. This phrase, freedom of navigation, constantly comes up with reference to China. Now, as I said in my opening, China's counter-argument is that the bulk of the $5.3 trillion trade that goes through these sea lanes, it's theirs and it's of the economies in the littoral states with which China's economy is interlinked. So it does not make any rational sense for China to try and disrupt that. Give me your sense of you know, what Mr. Shamlou said about France's reasons and also this freedom of navigation bit.
I think actually that what Mr. Shamlou has said seems to be echoed very much in a variety of other capital cities I can think of, which are increasingly concerned about Chinese actions in maritime zones, particularly the South China Sea and East China Sea. So you hear similar conversations actually in London at the moment. Despite Brexit, it's worth saying that in terms of defense and security in the Asia-Pacific, there's a lot of discussion in London these days, which sounds in some ways quite similar to what we've just heard from Mr. Shamlou about France, including the deployment of new UK aircraft carriers in the region, which I suspect will make the Chinese very unhappy if that happens. You can also hear similar, slightly less loud conversations, in fact, in Tokyo, which tends to be more discreet about public rhetoric, but also have an extremely well-armed self-defense force that's very aware of these issues. So I think China would argue that it has always been that has had its borders under attack, whether it's, you know, from foreign invading armies or indeed the past of Western gunboats turning up with shipments of opium in the late 19th century, sets an unhappy precedent. The difference is, of course, today China is an extremely strong state, whereas 100 years ago it was a very weak state. And therefore, I think the analogy is not one that can be entirely comforting to China's neighbors, but it is one that China steeps in its own history when it makes that argument.
Right. One final question, Rana. This whole idea, since we talked about how the past informs the present, one century, what the Chinese call the century of humiliation. Lots of my Chinese guests have, it's been a motif of sorts, have talked about that, and one gets the sense that this is kind of deep-rooted, and that the Chinese have decided that, you know, never in the future will they allow anyone to step on their soil or to, basically push them or dilute their sovereignty? And how far do you think is this idea, the century of humiliation, significant to the Chinese foreign and military policies?
I think you cannot grow up with Chinese history and Chinese culture and Chinese literature without understanding that period, that century of so-called humiliation when foreign powers attacked China over and over again, without knowing that it's a very important element of formation of China's mindset. On the other hand, I think it's worth saying, and this is something I say gently to my Chinese friends, it is not sufficient. It happened because China was very weak and not through its own fault, necessarily 100 to 150 years ago. But today, China is a huge economy. It's got the second biggest military in the world as well. It's extremely well respected and embedded around the world. Just say these factors make it very different from the past. And I think it's worth pointing out that although we should respect China's history and understand why it thinks the way it does, that does not give it carte blanche to do anything it wants geopolitically and simply appeal to wounded pride in the past as an excuse. That will not work in the 21st century.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Professor Rana Mitter speaking with us. Let me go back to Mr. Shamlou here. Mr. Shamlou, I heard your reasons for why France is in South China Sea, but would you agree that this presence would be considered by the Chinese as aggressive, and the Chinese would, instead of being able to check China, it'll actually goad China into becoming more aggressive?
I completely agree with that, because China, as my colleague said, is a superpower now. It's the second largest economy in the world, the second military, and they wanna be part of that. China, they wanna stay in this position. And if France still goes there and try to navigate in this region of the world, which China considers as its own region, then China, not now, but in the future, might get more aggressive and might be very offended.
Right. Stay with me, Mr. Shamlou. I'm also joined by Andrew K.P. Leung. Mr. Leung is chairman of Andrew Leung International Consultants. Mr. Leung, we were talking about, one particular peg is that now France has also decided to patrol the waters of South China Sea. And Mr. Shamlou was saying to me, well, France is doing this because France considers itself a superpower. It's also a nuclear weapon state, and it also believes in freedom of navigation. Now, my argument constantly has been that the volume of trade, about $5.3 trillion, that passes through these sea lanes, bulk of that is for the Chinese economy and for economies in the regions with which the Chinese economy is interlinked. Now, to think that China would disrupt that, which would obviously be self-defeating, does not appear very rational to me. What is your sense about this argument of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea?
Well, I mean, the whole scenario is not one-sided. As far as China is concerned, apart from territorial integrity, its territorial claims, there is, of course, a very real national security concerns, in the sense that the South China Sea is a vital sea lane of communication, representing is a lifeblood, economic lifeblood of trade, international trade, as well as import of resources on which its economy relies. So, and the perception that China is now being encircled by the so-called first island chain, second island chain, dominated by military, American military assets, of course, represents a threat. And then, of course, I mentioned about other terms, including, of course, the question of Taiwan. So there's no surprise that China would guard its sea lane position very jealously, not only because of the so-called century of humiliation, And of course, as far as France is concerned, the French question, now France seems to be joining the United States and the so-called Quad of nations, including Australia, Japan, in patrolling the South China Sea. The reaction in China, I think, is not overhyped. It's rather balanced because France isn't simply not a superpower. I mean, France is not even not the kind of maritime power it used to be. So just patrolling, just one, maybe two ships, it doesn't make a big difference. Of course, China would complain that other countries are just threatening its own kind of national interest in the region. But I don't think that China would overreact. And don't forget also, France has been quite aware of developing a very good trading relationship with China, and is, of course, is an instrumental behind the recently minted EU-China investment agreement. So I think that this is a nuance. Is not just a one-sided, one-dimensional scenario.
Right. I'm so happy that you talked about the EU-China trade deal because that deal has resulted in China becoming the bigger trading partner of the European Union than the United States. And China also has this regional economic comprehensive partnership, which is the biggest free trade bloc in the world right now. Volume of about $26 trillion, covers population, 30% of the global population. So it seems to me that China is not really in any mood to start having conflicts when it can influence the world through trade linkages and investment.
Well, naturally, it is not in China's interest to start a war, nor is it in the interest of the United States or the European powers to start a war in the Asia-Pacific. But of course, the China, the West, led by the United States, has got to make a statement in the sense of not agreeing with China's so-called territorial claims, and also to show that there is a Western pushback against what is perceived as China's assertive behavior in South China Sea. And that, of course, is likely to continue. But that doesn't mean that the two sides would want a war. But as far as China is concerned, there are, of course, a number of issues there. More and more countries view China as a threat. In fact, according to public opinion, large parts of the world have a relatively negative views of China compared with about 5 or 6 years ago. So I think that China has got to take all this in its stride. And of course, China doesn't want, has got no ambition to kind of kick out the United States as world hegemon, because simply China hasn't got the military capability, and nor would it be wise for China to do so, because there is a question of overreach, and there's also the question of there is not much in it, and far better for China to remain the world's largest economy and the world's biggest market.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung speaking with us. Very quickly, Mr. Shamlou, because I have to wrap up also. It seems to me, given China's stress on connectivity, trade linkages, investment, and the rest, that perhaps it will be a better framework to engage China cooperatively rather than sort of, posturing in a way that might just turn things or, for the things to take a negative direction.
Of course, China will do economic pressure everywhere it can, and it has a lot of power economically. And as my colleagues said, and as you said, I just want to come back to one thing. I said that France is a superpower. France is actually, you are right, is a middle seas power, but it considers itself as a superpower because it is a nuclear power and it has a permanent seat in the United Nations Security, which has a right to veto every decision that can be made by the United Nations. So things will stay the same, and France and the United States will go to that region in order to try to contain China, but at the end, things will not gonna change. China's gonna keep their leading and their head position in that region of the world.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Koorsh, Shamlou speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the ongoing protests in Myanmar. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Protests in Myanmar continue. So far, at least 21 protesters have lost their lives. Military leaders overthrew Aung San Suu Kyi's elected government on 1st February and have placed her under house arrest, charging her with possessing illegal walkie-talkies and violating the country's national disaster law. On Tuesday, Ms. Suu Kyi appeared in court. This was an online appearance to face fresh charges. Meanwhile, Myanmar's permanent representative to the United Nations says he still represents his country. Last week, he had made an impassioned speech rejecting the military takeover. He sent a letter saying he remains the rep, but a deputy ambassador to the UN from Myanmar claims that he is now the man the military authorities want to represent the country. He too has sent a letter to the United Nations headquarters. Demonstrations in various ASEAN countries continue to support the protesters in Myanmar. Protesters are demanding an end to the military's rule and want Ms. Suu Kyi released along with senior members of her National League for Democracy party. In his first foreign policy address at the State Department, U.S. President Joe Biden had mentioned Myanmar, expressing his administration's concern over events in that country. 2 weeks ago, at the foreign ministers' online meeting of the Quad countries, Japan's foreign minister Toshimitsu Motegi had expressed Tokyo's grave concern over the coup and subsequent human rights violations by the junta. Japan is the biggest donor to Myanmar. To discuss the latest developments, I'm joined by Dr. Welsh, currently Honorary Research Associate with the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute, Malaysia, based in Kuala Lumpur; Simon Billenness, Executive Director, International Campaign for the Rohingya and Director, No Business with Genocide; and Ismail Wolff, a Bangkok-based journalist and writer who's been covering human rights issues and politics in Southeast Asia for nearly a decade. Thank you to all my panelists. Thank you especially to Dr. Welsh and Mr. Billenness, who I spoke with last week, also with reference to developments in Myanmar. So let's begin with Mr. Billenness. Mr. Billenness, you had given me a sort of a roadmap of sorts of what all can be done to pressure the junta in Myanmar, but it seems that instead of giving way to some demands, they're just doubling down.
Now for the international community to make it very clear to this military junta that they are crossing a red line. And if they want any kind of international recognition, if they want any kind of international trade or investment, they cannot keep killing people in the streets. And so we've been pressing governments to impose much tougher sanctions on the military. And also we're working really closely with the civil disobedience movement on the ground. They are already going after Myanmar military businesses. And as they take down and boycott those military-owned businesses inside Myanmar, we have their back, and we will continue to press foreign investors to stop doing business with the Myanmar military.
Right. Mr. Wolff, I believe you also working very closely, not just observing the situation, but also working very closely with those who are obviously opposed to this takeover. Give me a sense of how you look at the situation, and do you think that enough pressure can be brought to bear on the junta for them to begin to sort of, walk back what they've done?
Thank you for having me on the show. I think that's a very difficult question to answer, unfortunately, where things are heading at this moment. I think what we can say, though, is that what Simon was saying there is the role of the international community is strong. It needs to show solidarity. And I think, as he was explaining there also, really repudiation of this coup, showing that they do not recognize the coup and do not recognize this government as legitimate. And that's where the support can come. The change really has to come from the people of Myanmar. And I think the civil disobedience movement is starting to have some inroads, but what we're seeing on the streets at the moment is really bloodshed and an attempt by the junta to terrorize the entire country. And the international community has to stand strong and say this will not stand. How the Myanmar military may react, I'm very concerned about where this is heading, and I think many others are looking at the trajectory we're seeing at the moment. But I think at the moment what we can say as observers, and myself as an outsider and not in Myanmar at the moment, is that support needs to be shown for the people of Myanmar who are standing up against this oppression.
Right. Dr. Welsh, last time we spoke about this issue, you had explained with great clarity the structural reasons for why the military in Myanmar operates in the way that it does. Now, given those reasons, and of course we talk about the fact that the world should get together and put pressure on Myanmar, we also know that there are structural reasons for why even stronger states would not really go in for a real push, which could serve as a salutary warning to the junta in Myanmar. And on the streets, as Mr. Wolff said, what we are witnessing is basically straight shooting of live ammunition into the crowds. So where would the world draw that line?
Well, we're going to see it happen. The problem is we're seeing a situation where things are escalating very seriously. We have moved in 1 month away from a potential for dialogue among parties within Myanmar. The protesters do not want the military to be playing any political role as opposed to a power sharing role. So the polarization is increasing. And as the military uses violence against its own citizens, and it's not just the shooting of the protesters, it's also the killings that are taking place at night, and also the harassment and other things that's happening across the country, 1,300 people arrested. I think that what you're going to see is a much stronger response within Myanmar, which potentially could increase the violence that we've seen. So I think the international community has been slow in responding to this. We saw over the last week that ASEAN has met and started the discussions and trying to promote dialogue. But the polarization within Myanmar itself prevents really a discussion, because both sides, multiple sides, are not necessarily recognizing the other and have very different visions of how this should end.
Right. Mr. Billenness, this is an interesting question or dilemma, if you will, and it's not just in Myanmar. This has happened in many other states across the globe, where you have either totalitarian governments or Praetorian militaries. So at some point, those who want a change have to make a decision with reference to whether they want all or nothing, or whether, as Dr. Welsh said, there can be, in order to defuse the situation, in order to move things forward, to have some kind of power sharing arrangement. Now, I understand from my little study of what has been happening in Myanmar that power sharing is something that has happened before, but in a way where the junta was constantly the dominant actor. So in the event that something can be worked out now, do you think that power sharing would yet again be one of the ways to get out of this mess?
Well, the military had power sharing before. Currently, or at least up until now, Myanmar operated under the 2008 constitution that was written by the military, which gave them a dominant role in the country's politics. It was a power-sharing, hybrid military-civilian government. But by doing this coup, the military has ripped up its own constitution. They have destroyed the power-sharing agreement that had been reached with the democratic movement led by Aung San Suu Kyi, and now they are going for total power. So if there's going to be any kind of power-sharing agreement, the military has to back down and reach a new agreement with the people and with their legitimately elected leaders, the National League for Democracy. And, at this point, all that we can do in the international community is keep up the pressure on the military, both political and economic, do whatever we can to act in solidarity with the civil disobedience movement, and by doing so, put enough pressure on the military to back down, and then, and only then, can the military, reach an agreement or go back to their barracks or do whatever they are forced to do. As I said, there was a power sharing agreement in Myanmar up until this point, but the military destroyed that as they took total power.
Absolutely, and that's what explains the dilemma. But Mr. Wolff, tell me, whenever there is a contest, whether it's an armed contest, whether it's a political contest, one of the things that one has to, or both adversaries would do, is to look at where the center of gravity is. Now, tell our viewers, what are those areas where if the junta is hurt or its interests are hurt, that it would come to the negotiating table?
It's a good question. I'm not a military or security expert, but I'll try to respond to that. I think one thing that needs to be sort of, analyzed and understood is what the drivers were for this coup at this time. As was just explained before, there was a power-sharing agreement. The military seemed to be in a strong position under that 2008 constitution. So what were the drivers to launch that seems to be a very drastic decision to overthrow that elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party? And whether this was something that was across the board within the military, whether this is something coming more directly from Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, the leader of the coup. So I think it's important to understand where the driving motivation has come from, where the control, where the decisions are being made behind this junta. And I think that's where you will try to find those weak points and where pressure can be brought to bear. As was mentioned before, I think economic sanctions, the global arms embargo, these are all options of the international community, external actors to try and bear that pressure. Internally, I think a lot of the pressure can be brought on by sort of trying to grind a halt to the operations of the state. And that's what the civil disobedience movement is trying to aim at, to really try and make it impossible for the junta to really operate the country and be able to make the decisions and move the country forward. And obviously, sort of economic interests are a huge driving force around all of this. And I think another thing that needs to be mentioned around this is the peace process, which has been, I would say, stalled for a long time, but was moving to some degree. So where does that come into it? Where do the ethnic armed groups, where do the ethnic communities come into this whole situation? There's a lot of different moving parts here, and I think one of the tactics that the ousted government and the political leaders from the NLD are trying to do here is ensure that there's first of all no international recognition of the coup, of this new what they say is an illegitimate illegal government, and that continues to bear some kind of pressure where they're not being accepted in the international community. But at the end of the day, as we've discussed earlier, I think those pressure points have to come internally. Potentially, if there are factions within the military, there could be some kind of sense that there would be some attempt to try and reach, as we say, some kind of discussion point to step back from this. But at the moment, it's very hard to tell. I think there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle that haven't yet come to light, and we need to understand those really to really understand the way out of this very, very worrying situation.
Right. Before I wrap up, let me go back to Dr. Welsh here. Dr. Welsh, last time we spoke, you made the point that the solution will come from within Myanmar. Now, we had a discussion on that, and I accept that point. But here's the thing. If the military is big on business, obviously it's, you know, that's something, it's basically dealing with lots of external state actors. And then, of course, other economic, prospects for the military. So perhaps one can identify the states that are dealing with the military in Myanmar and then get civil society actors or legislators to put pressure on the governments in those states so that they can put sanctions in a way, a regime that doesn't hurt people but actually targets the junta's interests. Now, is that a course of action? Do you think that is reasonable, or that's possible?
Two different types of issues and options. The first of which is boycotts inside countries outside of Myanmar of businesses that are involved with the military. And so this will put pressure within Southeast Asian countries, for example, on businesses that are actually helping to support this military government. The second option is the type of sanction measures that are in play. One of the things that was used against Russia was something called third-party sanctions, so that now currently most of the sanctions are focused on military leaders, their families, and the business entities. They've been relatively narrow in scope. And when a third-party sanction is imposed, it means that any other entity that is involved with these entities could actually be liable for punishment. So this means entities in Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand could also be facing problems for their relationships with military businesses. And I think this is why, because of a globalized environment where Myanmar is more integrated into the international and regional economy, sanctions actually have potentially a wider regional scope. And I think that there becomes more entry points to put pressure on the military, despite the fact that the pressure outside will still be limited. But the fact is that there are more pressure points. And those pressure points can come from outside and, has been noted earlier, from inside the country.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Bridget Welsh. Thank you to Simon Billenness. Thank you, Ismail Wolff. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.